So welcome and thanks again for joining us. As we move into this month of June and as we all reemerge from our isolation and our COVID staying at home, we're going to talk about joy. And it's funny because this is so like the universe. As I was preparing this talk, I was not feeling all that joyful. Those of you who know me know that I also work as a lawyer. I have stuff coming up. It's been stressful, it's been burdensome, and it's been a tough week. It's been taxing and tiring. And as we say, I was not feeling the joy. But then I realized that is the perfect time to write a talk on joy, because joy is an attitude of life. It's not a byproduct of lucky circumstance. We are looking for more solid ground than that. We are looking for a state of mind that we carry with us through all life's circumstances. And that's what I want to talk about this week. So you could fill my house and your house as well with books and DVDs and seminar materials that teach us to be joyful. I'm sure you have read many. You probably have attended some. No one has gone broke telling other people that they don't have enough joy in their lives, and here's how you get more. It's a multi-million-dollar business. However, like everything else on this path, it comes down to your own work, your own unfolding, your own practices. You already have the answers and the path. Anything I tell you or anyone else tells you is not new. Whatever speakers you hear, all we're doing is just reminding you of things you already know. I mean, really, that's what an aha moment is. When you hear something and it resonates with you and you go, yes, I knew that. Thank you for bringing it up. I remember. That's what it means when something resonates with you. So today you're going to hear me talk about joy and also about happiness. For my purposes today, they really are the same thing, although you can come up with definitional differences and we can talk about that. But for today, I'm going to talk about them as though they are the same thing. When I think of either, I imagine a state of contentment, of deep peace, and of what they call in the Buddhist tradition, equanimity. So as I was looking into this topic, I came across some authors who, figuratively speaking, were shaking their fingers at those of us who wanted to seek personal happiness for putting so much emphasis on finding happiness in our own lives. Why? Well, they say it's selfish. We should put others first. We should take this emphasis away from me, me, me. In our culture, we are so imbued with a zero-sum mentality. If I am pursuing my own happiness, it's got to mean that I am sacrificing yours. There's only so much in this pie. That's not the way it works. It's not either or, it is both and. We have all known people who exude joy and peace. And who are they? They are the ones we want to be around. We don't look at them and say, oh, you're so selfish because you're so happy, I am less happy. No, we want to be in their energy, to rest in their presence. We want what they have. They just make us feel better. They make us feel more joyful. It's not an issue of Puritan guilt. We do not need to waste a second worrying that we shouldn't be thinking about what makes us happy. We need to. Being miserable is not a virtue. My misery does not add a bit to your own happiness or anyone else's. We are not here to be that small. We are here to reflect the divine love that created and sustains us. And we do that with joy. We do that with happiness. As Pierre Teilhard de Chardin said, joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God. One of the heartening truths that I have learned as I've traveled my own spiritual path is directly related to joy. As I learn about, as I read about the wise men and women of generations past or of today, I find that each is deeply joyful, no matter what their personal circumstances. They found that the deeper grew their connection to the divine, by whatever name they called them, whatever faith tradition they followed, the deeper their connection to the divine was, the deeper grew their capacity for and their experience of joy. St. Francis of Assisi described his religious order as a society of joy, and he told his monks to always be joyful. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century Christian theologian, put joy at the center of the spiritual life. We don't think of that when we think of Thomas Aquinas, but he did. What is the nature of God? Aquinas wrote, God delights. God is always rejoicing and doing so with a single and simple delight. In fact, it is appropriate to say that love and joy are the only human emotions that we can attribute literally to God. That's just wonderful. In the Hindu tradition as well, the goal of our awakening is bliss, eternal joy. The Yajur Veda teaches, the one who loves all intensely begins perceiving in all living beings a part of himself. He becomes a lover of all, a part and parcel of the universal joy. He flows with the stream of happiness and is enriched by each soul. This joy, I think, is how we know the presence of the sacred. There is a lightness, a spaciousness that comes for each of these souls with a clear connection to Source. It simply deepens them, it grounds them, and when you are in their presence, you simply can tell it. When I think of happiness in wise men and women of our age, I think of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, about whom I've spoken before in this context. Despite being exiled since he was a young teenager from his homeland, leading a beleaguered and embattled Tibetan people under Chinese occupation, experiencing the loss of so much, he remains so full of laughter and joy and fun. He will tell you his life is full of joy. He gives his most to everyone he meets, making each person feel that he or she is the only other person in the room. His Holiness teaches that the purpose of life is to be happy, that it is possible for us to seek and find happiness. He writes, one great question underlies our existence. What is the purpose of life? After much consideration, I believe that the purpose of life is to find happiness. Now, by happiness, he doesn't mean pleasure or transitory good feelings that depend on outer events going our way. Even wonderfully good things, and I'm sure you found this in your life, even wonderfully good things give us only a temporary lift. They've done studies, for example, of lottery winners, and they find that after the initial high, what do these people do? They generally return to their pre-winning state of content or discontent. For me, a trip, perhaps, to Best Buy, I love electronics, or Office Depot gives me a wonderful lift, but it doesn't last. By happiness, the Dalai Lama refers to inner contentment, deep peace that is not shaken by outer circumstance. The happiness he refers to, that he believes is attainable by all of us, he says we can get it by training our consciousness, our hearts, our spirits, our minds. It is very doable. He started his training when he was 4, after he was selected as the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, and he began his training. He calls for an inner discipline gained through daily practice. He himself meditates and prays 4 hours a day, but fortunately for the rest of us, he says that is not required. He suggested we just find time, however much time we can, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, a half an hour, not even that much if you don't think that it's doable. We can all find some time simply to train our minds. In his book, The Art of Happiness, co-authored with psychiatrist Howard Cutler, the Dalai Lama talks about the first steps to moving into an energy of joy, and I want to talk about that a little more today. He tells us of the importance of cultivating the ground for a joyful life. That's what he means when he talks about training our mind. What we are doing is cultivating the ground for a joyful life. It is this training that has enabled him to be the beacon of joy that he is, despite all he has suffered and all he has seen. So, how does he recommend we train our minds? Keep in mind that these are his thoughts. Each of the sages I've mentioned, or other ones I could think of, or that you can think of, has his or her own. This is your path, so you create your own. And perhaps it's worth thinking about this week or this month. How do you train your mind to turn toward joy? The first thing we realize is that we have enough right now, right here, to be happy, which is an amazing thought. We are such an acquisitive culture. And the way advertising, for example, works is it tells us that if we want to be happy, we need this, we need that. We're not going to be happy until we have these things, or all of it. What His Holiness is teaching us, and what other sages teach us, is that we have enough right now to be happy. As Cutler writes, the message is clear. We don't need more money. We don't need greater success or fame. We don't need the perfect body or even the perfect mate. Right now, at this very moment, we have a mind, which is all the equipment we need to achieve complete happiness. What a revolutionary thought. All this time, we've been carrying it around with us. The first step, His Holiness says, is learning. Learn how negative emotions and behaviors hurt us and how positive ones build us up. When we feel negative toward others, he teaches, we are filled with negativity and hatred. We have all been there. I have been there, filled with negativity. So what does this do? This leads us to view others as hostile as well, even if they may not be. It just affects the way we look at the world. It's the toxicity within us expressing as our world view. This leads to fear and insecurity as we look at our world, a sense of being beleaguered or unsafe in a hostile world. It also leads to isolation and to separation. Who wants to connect with others in a hostile world? It is better to stay in, to stay safe, associate only with those we know who think like us, who look like us. The walls go up and the doors shut. On the other hand, he writes, if you maintain a feeling of compassion, loving kindness, then something automatically opens your inner door. Through that, you can communicate much more easily with other people, and that feeling of warmth creates a kind of openness. You will find that all human beings are just like you, so you'll be able to relate to them much more easily. When you can do that, with that, you feel less need to hide, more ability to trust and extend yourself to others. Separations are overcome, connections grow. Our emotions, what he is saying, is our emotions extend into our views and our choices. And at the very least, we have to be aware of what it is that powers so much of our outlook and our behavior. As I say so often, it all begins with awareness and willingness. So, if you want to be happy, identify those mental states that move you further away from happiness and closer to suffering. What are they? And this is something we do for each one of us. What are they? They are hatred, greed, perhaps, jealousy, resentment, to name a few. We think about the causes of them in our own lives. We shed the light of clarity and awareness on what is behind these negative emotions. They make you smaller, they close up your heart, and they shrink your world. At the same time, we identify those emotions and those behaviors that lead to greater happiness, love and compassion, kindness, service. Focus on them. Make the choice to let them occupy your attention. You have a choice in what occupies your mind. Sometimes that is a hard thing to realize, that we have a choice in what occupies our mind. I mean, I've met so many people who, when they're in the grip of negativity, they just say, I can't help it, I can't help it. And maybe they can't for that moment. But that is what a regimen of awareness and clarity will help us do. It will help us with those moments when we feel that we can't help it. Because at the end of the day, we have a choice in what occupies our mind. So, am I saying to ignore negative emotions? No, not at all. We all experience them, and we don't grow emotionally or spiritually by ignoring them and by packing them away. I started this talk by telling you that this past week and even today, I had been in a negative mood arising from a tough week. What the Dalai Lama and others teach us is that these emotions lose their sting when we stop running from them. When we accept them, we sit with them, we learn whatever it is they are telling us, and we move through them. So, just using myself as an example, how did I do that today to the extent I have? I may feel negative 5 minutes after I stop this talk, but to the extent I have been able to do that today, what practices have I used? Well, first, I realized that these emotions are passing. I moved my awareness to the present and away from regret of the past or fear of the future. By doing those basics that we do every week, by sitting and breathing and listening, smiling, being grateful, gaining perspective, all tools, these are all tools that we have discussed before. As I've said, they work if you work them. And the other thing about them is they're very intentional. You have to just make the decision that you want to shift your view to something more positive, and that you have to know that it is something that you can do. But I need to be reminded every day, despite many years and many lessons. I guess that's why they call it practice. We just keep working at it. The Dalai Lama acknowledges that change is slow and it is not easy. So what are some steps that help? Here we can look at practices from different faith traditions for some helpful guidance. You can certainly think of your own. For example, one of the 5 pillars of Islam is prayer 5 times a day. Why not just morning and night, or maybe just once? Because it helps to be reminded throughout the day to stop and touch the sacred, to give praise, to give thanks, to step back from all the busyness and connect with the holy. Other faith traditions do the same. Many have mechanisms that permit us to stop during the day and simply be. Some involve prayer and others don't. To quote Rumi, there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. So in his interviews with Bill Moyers, Joseph Campbell tells the story that somebody once asked a Shinto priest to explain Shinto ideology and theology. So after thinking for a little bit, he said, "We don't really have any ideology or theology. We dance." So dance. The sacred is all around us, and there are so many ways to touch it. The next step that comes that moves us further into lives of joy is what the Dalai Lama calls ethical behavior. This involves getting off the couch, perhaps out the door, and putting principles into practice. It involves behaving with kindness toward others, surely, but there's also a focus on yourself. It involves what he calls wholesome behaviors toward ourselves, being kind to ourselves. Take those positive emotions and that awareness and focus it on yourself. Do we treat our bodies well? Eating and drinking in moderation. Do we abuse substances or smoke or drink too much? Do we take time to rest, to exercise, to do those activities that we love? In other words, do we behave in ways toward ourselves that reflect love and compassion, or disregard and even dislike? Again, our choices have consequences. I have found from personal experience that the changes we make in behavior toward ourselves do not have to be huge in order to be meaningful. Sometimes we despair because we can't make those big, significant changes, so we decide not to do anything. Small steps, however, micro choices, make a huge difference. The brilliant polymath Buckminster Fuller has given us an image of transformation that I love and that I find incredibly helpful when I think about change. He came up with the image of a trim tab on a ship, a big ship. Think about this. They have rudders, but these are huge ships like the Queen Mary. They have huge rudders, but just turning the rudder to move the ship creates too much pressure. So the rudder has a tiny miniature rudder attached to the edge, and it's called a trim tab. If you move the trim tab just a little, it creates a pressure that ends up pulling the big rudder around, and it ultimately turns the ship. Tiny pressure, big change. Fuller said that each of us can be a trim tab in our impact on the world. Just a little pressure from one can make a huge difference. On his tombstone in Massachusetts is engraved, "Call me Trim Tab." In the same way, tiny changes in our own lives can yield significant transformation over time. Don't despair if the big changes aren't coming. Trust the power of the trim tab and keep making the small changes. They will make a significant difference. My sister a while back gave me a little plaque for my office. It reads, "Happiness is something you decide ahead of time." Sometimes deep wisdom does indeed come on a plaque, because this one is entirely right. We can decide ahead of time, and we can make the changes that take us where we wish to be. Trust yourself. You know what emotions lead you into greater joy, and what emotions and behaviors take you farther from it. Be aware of your choices, and you too can open the door to greater joy.